Susa on foot around the neck of the Elamite general. Did the walking chains, supposedly. And then the various generals are brought out and punished, and there's a psychological twist to a certain punishment by the way that is part of kind of what the Persians were sort of do away with. Here's what A.T.M. stated. Writes, I'm going to try my best at some of the pronunciations of these Mesopotamian names. They are wonderful. Ashurbanipal was about to leave Arbela for Nineveh, and the severed head of the Elamite ruler was entrusted to his general, Danunu's neck, for transport. As the musicians led the ghastly procession into Nineveh, the terrible sight crazed Hamundara and Nabu Damik, the ambassadors who had received their commissions from the dead man. One tore his beard, the other thrust his girdle sword into his bosom. Aplia, son of Nabu Ushallam and grandson of the famous Merodach Baladan, was extradited from Elam. Manu Kiahi, Danunu, and Nabu Ushallam, the Gambulu chieftains, had spoken blasphemy against the Assyrian gods, and for this crime they had their tongues pulled out by the roots and were skinned alive. The horrible scene is represented on one of the reliefs, although, strangely enough, Olmsted writes, the names have never been filled in the blanks left for the purpose. Danunu was placed on the rack and slaughtered like a lamb. His brothers Samgunu and Aplia were slain, and their flesh distributed among the surrounding lands. Nabu Naid and Belatir, sons of Nabu Shumarish, were forced to crush the bones of their father, and the head of the Elamite king found its final resting place over the gate which led to Ashur. Ashur being a primary Assyrian city. The forcing the sons to crush the bones of the father is one of those really psychologically horrible things. And you'll see this in other occasions. The Babylonian king, for example, who supposedly once he took Jerusalem, took the ruler, the king, and forced him to watch the slaughtering of his two young sons in front of his eyes, and then had his eyes put out so that the last thing he saw was that. I mean, those are the extra little cruelties that just seem, well, that just seem calculated to subdue somebody's will to resist, but you could easily see how it might have the opposite effect. You could see how a people coming after this time might be able to make all sorts of political hay, selling themselves as the alternative to this kind of cruelty. And you can also see why, when Assyria fell, there were not a lot of tears cried. It was gone, in fact. Even the biblical prophets are rejoicing. As I was trying to come up with some sort of analogy to try to define the stakes here with what's about to happen, all I could think of in my uncreative mind was the idea of the United States over the next 5 or so years somehow, with jaw-dropping, astonishing events, fell apart or imploded, broke into some kind of civil war, ended up getting involved in maybe a foreign war at the same time. I mean, you never know how these things are going to turn. Remember how you felt if you were old enough to remember the 9/11 attacks that went on television while you watched them. There's almost nothing positive that comes out of something like that. But one of the few things that was, in my mind, was as you watched it, you were reminded that the most astonishing things not only can happen, but will happen. They're like earthquakes. You know there's going to be a big one, you just don't know when. You know there's going to be some massive jaw-dropping historical event in the future, you just don't know the date ahead of time, like 9/11. You watch that happen. That astonishment is how mankind has felt over and over and over again. As you look back on it, there's about to be an astonishing moment in the story. It's not really a moment. 5 to 15 years, it just appears astonishing now. But it's akin to the United States imploding. Really, I think it's more than the Soviet Union falling, but a little less than the modern United States going away. Nonetheless, if the United States did go away for its 5 years, what does the international situation look like then? What world instantly springs up to replace such a calm? How does that go? This is actually a world that is going to exist as soon as this story that must be, one of the great events in all human history, but we don't know because we don't have a Herodotus there to give it, even with a bunch of lies and exaggerations and untruths that may have filtered in over the hundreds of years. We don't have his version or anyone like him to explain it to us. We lack the cup. Herodotus, by the way, promised he was going to tell this story in one part of his histories and then never did. Or it didn't come down to us or something. A few terse Babylonian sources, and that's it. In fact, the stuff you thought you could count on, like those wonderful Assyrian, pronouncements by the King of Kings, I went in there, I planted thorn bushes, I killed everybody. That ends in like 639 BCE, ominously and mysteriously, all of a sudden. What the heck's going on? I love the different ways the historians try to describe this too. One historian says it was unclear what was happening. Author Mark Healy explained the importance, though, of this period's silence, because he says, quote, "And it is in the silence of those years that is written the fate of the Assyrian Empire," end quote. So the important stuff is happening, we just don't know much of what it is. Open to interpretation, is how another historian put it. Here's what basically goes on. Ashurbanipal's reign. At the end, you start to see things fraying. You begin to see places that were under Assyria's control on the margins break free. A lot of historians think that it's rather telling that all of a sudden you can have these Scythian tribes riding roughshod now in areas where the Assyrians used to keep them out. It must mean that they can't. While no one is really paying a lot of attention, the Medes are beginning to fuse, sort of, and it's unclear how they did this with the Elamite civilization. Could have been peaceful, could have been warlike, could have been diplomatic marriage, but it's making both civilizations stronger. And Ashurbanipal dies, and his sons go to war with each other. Now, this is not uncommon in Assyrian royal succession, but this is coming at a particularly bad time, because all of a sudden the Babylonians are resurgent again. They've got a new dynasty. They've got an army that is modeled. It's a not as effective copy of the Assyrians. The Assyrians copy the Babylonian civilization not quite as well as the Babylonian original. And the Babylonians copy the Assyrian military, though it's not quite up to the original standards either. But when you've been fighting one half of your army against the other, which is what the Assyrians were doing in the Civil War, that's why they're so ruinous. You have outside powers starting to loom over you, and what do you do with your army? You divide it in half and fight it against each other. Worst possible thing that could happen. And then the Babylonians, starting in about 616, start sending out an army, taking some of these border cities between Assyria and Babylon. And then the war heats up a little bit, and they're fighting back and forth, and the Assyrian army seems to be a shadow of its former self. But you can see how strong it still is, because they're holding their own against these Babylonians, pushing them back sometimes, chasing them back sometimes. But it's all they can handle. And then in like 615 BCE, the Medes jump in from the east and the north. They start taking cities in the east. The next year, the Medes come forward under their king Cyaxares and advances on, one of the capitals, Nineveh. Can't take it because Nineveh is this massively fortified, probably the most fortified city west of China in this whole human history up to this point. Just an incredible feat, a human marvel, and it pushes these Medes sideways. They just can't deal with it right now. But unfortunately for the Assyrians, if you can't go out there and defeat that Median army, they can do whatever they want. So they go sack a nearby city that's not as well defended. It just happens to be Ashur. Assyrian capital is vital, connected to their religion and their god, and morale and everything else. It's a big deal. At the last minute, the Babylonians run up to be a part of it. This is a famous event. They don't want to allow the Medes to take this important city by themselves, be left out of the spoils, the reputation, everything, but they arrive too late with their army. The Medes have already sacked the place, maybe rushing the attempt so that they'd beat the Babylonians there. They treat it the way the Assyrians would have treated it, and it's a horrific event. The Babylonian king and the Median king pledge their friendship to each other as Ashur burns in the background and killing continues and the slaves are being dragged off. All of a sudden, a week into Syria has Babylon and the Medes working together and advancing on Nineveh in 612 BCE. If this wasn't bad enough, at the last minute, allegedly, not everybody says this, but the standard belief is at the last minute, a horde of Scythians rides in wild northern horsemen and joins both the Medes and the Babylonians in this last assault upon this greatest of West Asian military fortresses. Together they take it down. They're going to fight 3 battles on the plains, supposedly, before they even got a chance to get near the walls, where this last old, aging, damaged line of Assyria swatting her way and fighting well, as long as they could. The Babylonian king, in a terse style, that those people wrote him, described what he did to what he calls the land of Subal, which is the north of Syria. And by the way, notice how he's couching this in terms of liberation. The Assyrian yoke. The records say, quote, "I slaughtered the land of Subarum. I turned the hostile land into heaps and ruins. The Assyrian, who since distant days had ruled over all the peoples, and with his heavy yoke brought injury to the people of the land, his feet from Akkad I turned back. His yoke I threw off." And you have a basic problem when discussing events of the past like this. If we're discussing something from recent history, say the end of the Third Reich in the Second World War, all that emotion is still felt. You get a real feel for the kinds of things historians don't want to touch once you get back a certain distance. Someday they're not going to look at the Nazis as the kind of evil that we do. They're going to somehow say, well, they were on the far end of the spectrum of what people did then, which is kind of what a lot of modern ones would say about Assyria. They're not doing anything anybody else isn't doing. They just may be at the far end of the spectrum of, conduct. It's all kind of relative, right? But you can certainly see the anger and vengeance in the people that goes beyond mere, the taking of loot and slaves and the things that have motivated soldiers sometimes in the heat of battle at all times. This involved some payback. Historian Mark Vandy explains that you can still see that vengeance today, and there's an eternal bit of payback that was done. He writes, quote, "The conquerors set out to destroy the cities of Assyria, taking revenge for the humiliations they had suffered at Assyria's hands. On wall reliefs of kings Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, for example, they identified the representations of the kings with the help of the inscriptions accompanying them and ritually destroyed them by cutting out the ears and eyes. These were not random acts of mutilation. In the detailed depiction of Ashurbanipal's defeat of the Elamites, for example, only the face of a soldier cutting off the head of the king of Elam was similarly destroyed, probably by the Medes, who saw the Elamites as their ancestors. Likewise, the records of loyalty oaths that King Esarhaddon had forced Median bodyguards to swear, and which had been stored at Calhu, were smashed. The palaces were burnt down only after the lengthy task of defacing images and destroying symbols of submission to Assyria had been completed." End quote. If you go to the British Museum today, look at the Assyrian beliefs, you can see the defacing done by some angry, vengeful, and probably rightfully so, soldiers as they took down Assyria piece by piece, but stunningly quickly by historical standards. And while there may be no Herodotus to this, who is one of the most, one of the most colorful sections of the Old Testament of the Bible that deals with the fall of Assyria. And I'm sure Assyrian descendants of people who are big Assyrian fans think this is very it's just their bad luck to get bad PR sometimes in the Bible compared to the prophet Legget, who was prophesizing supposedly that you're going to get it. And then once they did get it, they were sort of saying, see, this is what you get. Now, what's kind of interesting about Nehemiah and some of his other prophets is there's a decent chance he was a contemporary. A lot of this stuff was put together in the some of this goes back. It's tough to know. Historians argue it's possible that this prophet name was maybe even a predecessor to some of these things. Who knows? You know, I don't know this. Because when he recounts what happens, first of all, he gives you the color, tells you a little bit about the story in a religious sort of framework. It still doesn't sound like rises. There's a religious tone to it, but at the same time, it's very colorful. He describes, for example, what the battle is like after prophesizing at the very beginning for a long time. He says, "He that shatters in pieces has come up against thee. Guard the wall, guard the way, gird thy loins, make thy strength the utmost. The shield of his heroes is red, his warriors are clad in scarlet. They prepare the chariots today. The chariot horses are eager. The chariots rage in the field. They rush to and fro in the plazas. Their appearance is like that of torches. They dart about like lightnings." He reads out the list of his nobles. In their eagerness they stumble. They hasten to reach the walls. The battering ram is made ready. Then Nahum describes the unleashing of the rivers. I guess the dams were open or rerouted, or they reroute the force of rivers or what have you, help undermine the walls. That's not that unusual a tactic in a big city like this. Small. Nahum says, quote, "The river sluices are open. The palace walls are crumbling. The queen is stripped of her clothing. They are leading her away captive. Her handmaidens moan like doves. Upon their breasts they are beating. Nineveh was a tank of water. From it they are now escaping. Stand, stand, they cry. Not one of them looks back." And he basically tells everybody to take back the stuff that Assyria took from them and that they're housing in this immensely wealthy city. He says, quote, "Take ye the spoil of silver, take ye the spoil of gold. There is no end to the store, an abundance of all goodly objects. She is empty and void and waste. Hearts melt, knees shake. There is pain in all loins, and pale have waxed all the faces." And then he does it. Trash talk. He says, "Where are the great lions now? All the people who took all this stuff?" And then, like again, so many of the people during this era, this was seen to involve, a little proof that their God was superior, or in the case of some of these people by this point in history, the only God. And Nahum says, quote, "Behold, I am against thee, says Yahweh of hosts. Thy lair I will burn with smoke. Their young the sword shall devour. I will cut off thy prey from the earth. No more be heard thy messengers' voices." He continues to rub it in and basically blame this on karma, if you will. "Woe to the bloody city, full of lies and robbery. The crack of the whip and the thunder of the rumbling wheel, the prancing horse and the bounding chariot, the horseman mounting and the flash of sword, the gleam of spear and the mass of slain, a heap of corpses. There are no end to the dead bodies. For the many infidelities of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of incantations, who sold states for her wicked deeds, and plans through her incantations. Behold, saith Yahweh of hosts, I am against thee. I will strip thee of thy clothing, and show thy shame to the nations. Filth I will cast upon thee, and disgrace thee. I will set thee up as a warning. All who see thee shall flee, shall cry, desolate Nineveh, who shall bewail? Well, listen, they may not have a ton of dramatic stuff from the Near East during this time period, but that's awesome. All history aside, that's awesome stuff. And it does give you a feel for the emotion of the time period. You may think, it's all been drained. That's somebody who's clearly thinking that Assyria is reaping what she sowed. And there are Assyrian people who have to live one piece of horrible PR making it down through the years. The most widely read book in history. The last Assyrian king is rumored to have been this is rumored to be still here and try to fight that idea that every last one of them was killed in their version of the Holocaust by America. It's not true. It's certainly so. In a short period of time, those rats on top of their era cities and fortresses were used by the famous passage that Jefferson said, with his 10,000 Greeks fleeing the Persian Civil War were getting chased out of the these great massive cities by most hours of the day simply rotting in the dust, deserted. But the walls are so high and the workmanship, on the streets and everything so modern that he doesn't understand where it came from. The locals don't know anything about Assyria. They think the Medes built it. In other words, within 200 years, these cities are lying in ruins. They're still larger than almost anything new being built at that time, and nobody even remembers that they were Assyrian. The account by Xenophon of these ghost cities, by the way, I've spoken about them before. It's the ultimate Statue of Liberty in the sand sort of historical moment. You know what I mean when I say that, right? The end of the Planet of the Apes, where Charlton Heston believes he's been on a distant planet the whole time. In the very last scene of the movie, he looks, and in the distance, with the surf crashing against